welcome today to Innovative Leaders Driving Thriving Organizations. My name is Maureen Metcalf, and we're joined by Paul Gibbons. Paul's recent book is called The Science of Successful Organizational Change, and today we're going to be talking about helping organizations be more resilient, so anti-fragile and agile. Today, Paul's going to talk more about his book, which is a continuation of an earlier interview a few months ago, focusing on large-scale change and the concept specifically of agility and being anti-fragile, which are key foundational concepts to helping organizations drive change, respond to external shocks, and maintain resilience so that they can leverage the shocks that others are undermined by.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. So in the chapter in your book on complexity and decision-making, you talk about the idea of anti-fragile. For some of our listeners, this is a new idea. So can you define it for us? What is it and why do we care?
So, the name is, I wish I'd coined it myself, but I did not. It comes from a guy called Nassim Taleb, who was a statistician and a derivatives trader. Actually, he and I were at the same firm on opposite sides of the ocean in the 1980s. And his third book, maybe his fourth, in fact, was called Antifragility. And so, it's a strange word, and it's a neologism, so he coined it himself. So he opens the book with a very beautiful metaphor. He says that fire is strengthened by the wind, and a candle is blown out. We want to be like the fire. And that's how he begins his discussion of antifragility. So all that's very abstract. What he wants to say is that there are certain things, particularly in nature, that are strengthened by stressors. And so that's the key concept of antifragility. No, it's often compared with resilience. And he doesn't mean that. He means much more. So resilience for a human being or a business means you bounce back, right? If I have a mishap or my business has a mishap, if I'm resilient, a few days later or shortly later, if I'm a business, I'll be back to where I was. Antifragility is I'll be back, and I'll be back much better than I ever was. So that's the concept in a nutshell.
I appreciate the distinction because I'm the one who said resilience. And I guess in my mind, I actually think of I become more resilient under stress.
Yes, resilience, your ability to bounce back is strengthened by life's mishaps.
So what are some real-world examples of anti-fragility in the business arena that our listeners can relate to?
Well, let's contrast it with fragile. So we can see fragile is a startup business with no capital. There's a slight market downturn and they're wiped out. So that's a fragile business. So the next step, and Taleb refers to this as the triad, is robust. So robust is better. What we try and do is protect our fragile systems from the world. We try and control, we try and manage, we try and ensure. And one strategy we use, for example, in banks, is we diversify. So if you diversify your assets widely enough in a bank, then when the storm hits, only a few of your assets will be hit and you'll be robust. So, and we all have a sense of resilience and robustness, and that's what we try and do, through most of societies. We try to manage, plan, control, and predict. So from Taleb's point of view, that's a mug's game, because we leave ourselves, when we try and do that, more vulnerable to the things that really matter, which are the black swans. So what's anti-fragile? What are some examples of that? If you put people in spacecrafts and take them where there's no gravity, their bones deteriorate. So the gravity, the pounding from running, from walking, from lifting, strengthens bone. Also, weightlifters strengthen muscles, but when they lift more weight than they can easily manage, they break muscle tissue down, but which results in an increased muscle mass and increased strength. And we all have a sense of how, many of us anyway, our emotional mishaps. We've become stronger, more compassionate, more resilient, and a better human being, if you want, through those mishaps. So it's easy to see at the kind of human level.
So, Paul, why should this be of interest to business leaders?
Well, businesses are very fragile things. So only one of the original Dow Jones companies from 1915, 101 years, old now, I believe it's General Electric, is still in business. So that's an extraordinary thing. If you think about it, that's a failure rate over a century of 92%. Now, if you think of a fact of species and ecosystems on this planet living for 500 million or a billion years, companies are very fragile things. And so I think every business leader wants to believe that they can build a legacy which will last far beyond their lifetime. And so there you have one interest we should have as business shareholders and business stakeholders, building a business which is not just robust, not can just defend itself against shocks, but is actually improved with and ready and able. I think I use this metaphor in the book. I hope Taleb wouldn't kill me for it. Is able to surf the waves rather than get swept over by them. And then so that's I think the high ground for businesses is that they're anti-fragile in that respect. And so I think most business leaders would nod their head at that as a concept, as something that's a desirable, if you will, attribute for a business. And as I said before, I don't think many are there. But IBM is one company that began by making scales for weighing produce in the late part of the 19th century. And then the early part of the 20th century, it was making meat slicers. And then it made punch clocks and coffee grinders and typewriters. And now I'm only up to the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And then it was right there at the computer revolution, the birth of the digital age in approximately 37. And then there's been probably nothing that's been more disruptive than the computer and the information technology revolution over the past about 75 years since the first computer went into operation. So they have been able to, despite their size, dance with all those different technologies.
What is it about an organization that allows me to ride that wave?
Oh, well, that's a fabulous question. I mean, I think one of the things that you see in nature is you see great redundancy of the subunits. So you see smaller subunits, which are interdependent, yet independent. And in nature, particularly, you see lots of destruction and recreation during these smaller subunits. And one example of that is the process of evolution, which is, a very harsh process. As I think it was Shakespeare said, nature is red in tooth and claw. So that internal destruction, I mean to say, within companies of small subunits and redundancy is certainly one feature. I think one thing also, if I may add, I mean, I have a list of several things, but one other thing is that we try to, in the world, make decision making based on predictions. So you've been in consulting a long time, Maureen. Mm-hmm. We make predictions of how long a project will take. We'll make a prediction of how big the market will be and how many units we'll sell and what market share we'll have. In fact, the whole world, you could say the whole business world is really based on some extent, even when you start any business, you're making a prediction about how it will prosper. And Taleb says, and I think I agree with him, that there are limits we have as human beings to be able to predict the future. Well, that sounds like a trivial thing to say. Of course we are, but his aim, if you will, with antifragility is to have a science of non-predictive decision making. How does that sound? Decision making that's not super duper sensitive to our predictions. Doesn't that sound interesting?
It does. And the term sensitive, I want to talk about that for just a second. So as I'm thinking of redundancy of subunits, specifically, I also think of organizations that have become incredibly lean. So if I run a restaurant in Ohio, where I'm based, and we're subject to, snowstorms in the winter, if I have just enough stock, if the interstates are closed for 2 days, what does that do to my business? So I'm incredibly lean, and that seems good for cash flow, but I'm not resilient, or I'm not
fragile.
able. Yeah, you're fragile.
For a worker today, if you get down to the perspective of a worker, is how do I have a career that's not fragile? And so one of the ways to have a fragile career is have a very narrow specialism in something that might, for example, be time boxed or something that's disrupted by technology. And then also not learn. Because if you were a computer programmer, for example, and you learned COBOL in the 1960s and 1970s, everyone else did, by the 1990s, you'd be out of date. And in fact, the pace of that particular industry, unless a computer programmer is reinventing themselves almost every several years, the pace is changing so quickly that unless you reinvent yourself every 2 or 3 years, you become a dinosaur. And so that's one example of how a career may be made fragile. Maureen, now I know you spend a lot of time developing senior leaders, and one of the things I sometimes see is that leaders will spend entirely too little time on their own development. There's a sort of culture in many organizations that by the time someone reaches 45, they've learned formally all they need to learn, and the rest of it they'll pick up by osmosis. And that's not the case with people who are, I think, the very best, who are always educating themselves, always developing themselves in some sense or another. But it's absolutely vital, I think, if you're going to be have any sense of agility or antifragility in your career, to be a lifelong learner. It's acute in industries like engineering and computer programming. It's acute in the sciences if you were a scientist trained in the 1970s and 1980s, unless you're keeping up. But in business, the culture and the demands on business people don't really require them. There's no really accountability for business people being up to date with the most recent ideas. Their feet aren't really held to the fire, I don't think, sufficiently.
So let me go back to something you mentioned earlier that was fascinating to me, and to me there's a connect here. You talked about black swans and non-predictive decision making.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, again, not learning. Tell me a little bit about non-predictive decision making.
Isn't it fascinating? It's a fascinating subject. So I think it's a new area. So one of the things that you know as a consultant is that when you put together a project plan, you put together a single figure budget, and you put together a plan that's got a single delivery date. So anybody who's ever been in project world know that those numbers are more often than not fantasies. It's documented in something called the planning fallacy. So what we need to do is model our businesses on the appropriate statistical distribution of outcomes. And at the very least, and I never see this. You see, I've been in consulting a very long time. When I see a consulting proposal, it's got a single number for the price and a single budget. So it's based on a prediction of how quickly they'll be able to do things. And organizations contort themselves to meet the time and budget. But we're living in a fantasy world, because in the real world of projects, as we know, there's a distribution of outcomes. And sometimes that distribution is a very long tail. I mean, sometimes projects take twice as long as predicted. So that's just one single example of how a leader can be much more live in the real world of non-predictive decision making and not base the success of their business on being able to predict the future with a level of certainty that's a fantasy.
As we look at leadership development and leadership maturity specifically, the underlying construct that we talk about is worldview. So it is foundationally changing my operating system for how I see the world. So do I look through the lens of making a mistake makes me bad, or do I look through the lens of, if I'm learning, of course I'm making mistakes? And those foundationally change everything I see and how I see it. So I'm going to wrap up because I want to give you an opportunity to steer people to your book.
What I tried to do in the Science of Successful Organizational Change, which came out in last June, is really take all of what I think the best thinking from intellectuals and researchers around the world in areas that business people don't read. So there's insights on antifragility from a statistician, there's public health and medicine and economics. So rather than a book which is a lot about business leadership being based on the soft sciences of psychology and so forth, really tried to bring the latest in the behavioral sciences to the practice of organizational change and update the world of change with 21st century thinking. So that's the ambition of the book. I hope some people might agree that I've realized it. And it's called The Science of Successful Organizational Change. And with that, thank you very much, Maureen.